Because you're really, in one, you're intra-metropolitan or intra-megapolitan, and in the other, you're between. And so some of the planning of our high-speed rail capacity, it strikes me as not making this adjustment and understanding that the run, by the way, along, if you go through San Antonio to Austin, slow down. You don't have to go that fast. Tucson, Phoenix, slow down. You don't have to go that fast. Phoenix, LA, move it. Move it because the substitution of that capacity is air, not ground-based. It's not somebody stuck in traffic on the I-4 corridor or the I-10 corridor between Phoenix and Tucson. So that's the difference in planning units as far as application to transportation, specifically to rail transportation, which is the highest speed rail needs to go between spaces as discrete and large scale as South Florida and the I-4 corridor. You need to jump that space. But within the I-4 corridor, within San Antonio to Austin, within Phoenix to Tucson, within those spaces, you need enhanced regional rail. Because it's not like somebody's going to fly, and so you don't have to compete against something going several hundred miles per hour, quite frankly. And so it looks like we overcharged and overdid the sort of rail through the I-4 corridor in some ways. And I'm supporting the idea of the residents of Polk County, which is multiple stops would allow them to create an actual genuine urban core through the county and deflect some of the development that would go to the periphery, some of the development that would widen out along that corridor, because it would give locational advantage to any place along that rail line if it made multiple stops. And it shouldn't make 10 stops, but if it even made 3 stops. And the reason is that you'd have access to a serious airport like Orlando from anywhere in that county. And you'd also have access to the other region in Tampa. The other thing that Tampa and Orlando can do is that right now one of the most over-reliant regions in the United States, except for Las Vegas, that exceeds 1 million residents, that's reliant on tourism and construction in combination, is Orlando. About 50% of regional product, of metropolitan product that comes out of Orlando is currently generated by tourism, and it's not well generated at the moment, and construction, and it's not well generated from that either. It is based on the American model of much of the post-war years of housing development, Sunbelt growth, consumption. When Orlando reaches to Tampa, it reaches into a metropolitan area with a slightly different economic mix that includes a serious port, one of the largest in the US. Trade and logistics as being part of that mix. So in a sense, the unified regional economy that will exist at 2030 or 2040 between Tampa and Orlando will be a more diversified economy because it will contain multiple components across that urban space that move away from just simple tourism. So the economic development diversity strategy for Orlando is literally convergence with Tampa. And Tampa is made into a sort of larger urban space by proximity and connectivity to Orlando, because Tampa did not win the game of big regional airports. Orlando's airport is a powerful airport because travel to Disney has induced multiple connections on a global scale to that airport. And the problem with a place like Orlando right now is it's very easy to fill the backs of the planes coming in, the coach section with tourists. But what is Orlando doing by way of high-level business services that would ever fill the front of an aircraft to it? So when Las Vegas or Orlando are in the similar situation and they lobby a major airline from Europe or Asia to allow direct connectivity that would help with business services, that would help diversify their economy, what they hear is, how are we going to fill the front of the plane? We're confident that Orlando can fill the back of the plane. The reason they want to fill the front of the plane is on overseas flights, the front of the plane pays for everything. That's where the money comes out. Well, the scale at which Tampa and Orlando will exist, which is millions and millions of people, when you put these two regions together, you're bigger than Dallas, really. The scale at which that region exists, and bigger than Atlanta, means that global traffic, air traffic and trade, which is already favored to, one, the port at Tampa, and two, the airport at Orlando, has that much greater reason to connect to that huge urban space. This region already has that quality. This region is already a diverse economy and has banking in Latin America. It's more mature as an urban space and is technically completely integrated. This was once a discrete series of metropolitan areas where you had coastal amenity, commuting sheds going due west out of here. So this was a separate space than Miami, because what you did is you had workforces that lived off the coast and then they worked at the coast. That was the original tourist development of South Florida. So every sort of linear east-west highway developed a separate distinct identity and a separate commuter shed off of it. And what's happened is this is all blurred together, and this region went in one census round to a fully integrated metropolitan area. This isn't a combined metropolitan area here. This is an official metropolitan area all the way from Palm Beach down to Miami, because it meets the 25% commuter interchange threshold, not the 15%. So and this is about 65 miles, 70 miles from core to core. This is one of the larger extended spaces in the country. By the way, Fort Worth and Dallas got to that condition too in the 1960s, which is incidentally how Dallas-Fort Worth Airport was originated. Dallas-Fort Worth were two regions that were proximate to one another, but in very discrete environments, and at first had very separate commuting, separate identity. Dallas was always seeking out headquarters firms and seeking out a kind of global presence, and Fort Worth was happy being a cow town. Till one day they both went and asked the federal government for an airport at the same time, and the federal government said, "We'll give you one, but you're going to get one between the two of you, because the census folks show that you're integrated already." And they put it right, when you land at Dallas-Fort Worth, you land on the county line, and the terminals are divided between the two key counties. And of course, Dallas County got the better terminals. That's always the sort of story with Dallas, always screwing over Fort Worth. But the reason I mention this is that they were the original region that reluctantly had to share space. And when they did, they not only got that airport, but they decided to rebrand their entire identity and come up with the Metroplex concept, which is they weren't twin cities. It wasn't, Minneapolis, St. Paul, or even Tampa, St. Pete. They had an inorganic identity. They were North Texas. It sounded like you were talking about longhorns and cattle and Amarillo and places like that. So they actually sat down, did focus groups, and branded and created a regional identity and regional cooperation that is a model for regions going forward. And I'd like to go through some of the categories where I see this cooperation most likely occurring. At the scale that I'm talking about, which is combined statistical area scale, Providence, Boston, Washington, Baltimore, Richmond, sooner or later, the things that make sense are three main categories of engagement. One is transportation, second is economic development, and third is environment, and especially things like water resources, which is a real problem in most of metropolitan America. Because the scale at which, let's start with just transportation. The reason even there are metropolitan planning organizations and that they have power now is that at one point the federal government realized that when it was giving aid to metropolitan areas, that the aid was being invested very often at cross purposes. That parts of a metropolis were building in one direction and another part was building in another direction. And that made no economic sense because they were functionally interdependent. In other words, even though you had County A say to County B, "We're not interested in working with you," people were commuting from County A to County B, and they were reliant on it being a single large-scale unified metropolitan space at which they were going to pursue their lives, their talents, their interests, everything. So the federal government finally turned around to regions and said, "Listen, we're not going to give you the money unless you plan in this scale and in this manner." That was, those Washington mandates, they're coercive, they're this and that. What it meant was that at least in transportation, not in schools, not in housing, not in all these other sensitive areas, but could you just agree in transportation that you do have a common purpose, that you have to think at the regional scale and you have to think of how people flow through a region on a daily basis, how goods flow through a region, how logistics work, and so on. And that's hard to argue against. It just doesn't make any sense to argue against it because it would be disproving the entire body of information that shows the value of this integration, that frictions in this movement produce inefficiencies and diseconomies and so on, and that it's worth just doing. So transportation is a safe hook to go to the next scale. The federal government could also just say this: "We won't give you the money unless you show us the plans for the combined statistical area." The census category exists. It would only require one line of change in the next federal piece of legislation that does transportation authorization, which comes up every several years. You could simply say, show us the plans at the combined statistical level. Now, what I'm saying to regions that are merging into combined statistical levels is before the federal government gets to you and forces this on you as an edict, it probably makes more sense to look ahead. The census will never give you a geography projected forward. They will only tell you the geography you exist at the moment. That has little value if you're doing long-range planning. If your long-range plans are 20 or 30 years out and you're going to converge, you might want to consider the scale of the convergence and plan accordingly. You might be planning for a whole different purpose for some of the spaces that you consider your periphery than proximate metropolitan areas that are sharing this metropolitan space in the future. And so it pays to get ahead. And so one of the things the federal government could say in terms of, especially right now where they already have legitimacy in this area, is on transportation, show us the plan. So Tucson, Phoenix, Tampa, Orlando, Austin, San Antonio, Providence, Boston, what's your plans right now? And I don't get a lot of feeling of pushback from these metropolitan areas in terms of transportation. In other words, that's something that there is easy agreement on, and there's places meeting all around the country. Tucson's talking to Phoenix on this and so on. Another area that's fruitful, and this is more of a voluntary area. It's voluntary, but it's one where the business interests in these regions are the most aggressive, let's just say, including the fact that some of these have already happened, and I'll give you a couple of examples, is economic development. And there are regions like Tampa, Orlando, and Tucson and Phoenix, where they are close enough so that the global market sees them as a unified space. In other words, from the worldview of investment from Germany or China, you can see how somebody could look at a Tampa and Orlando and say, well, this is close enough to where you're essentially working in terms of global movement of goods, global movement of business in a unified space. And there's been rivalries famously. Every city that's got a proximate nearby city doesn't like it for one reason or another. And Tampa and Orlando don't seem especially aggressive in this disdain. Tucson, Phoenix, I've been on these sort of, people come in trade missions from like Germany and they want to do solar. And Germany's quite advanced in solar because of public policy. They're promoting the purchase of solar generated energy. And so Germany's well ahead and investing worldwide, and they're looking at places like the Southwest for energy generation. And they come to Phoenix and Tucson and they get told by the people of Phoenix and Tucson things like, Tucson says, well, we don't like Phoenix because they're like the Disney desert. They're a mini LA. And Phoenix is like, Tucson looks like a hick town. There's no good airport down there. And from Germany, they just laugh. They're like, we can't even tell you apart. They're both deserts. They're in the same state. One's got more Circle Ks or something. They don't give a damn. These little petty things that sound so impressive and important in terms of, the sort of sibling rivalries and these like in-house fighting and family squabbles mean nothing to the global economy. In fact, if you let them get in your way of integration, they will subtract from your capacity to fully integrate into the global economy and to do exporting and the like. So there are already, and there are assets in, by the way, both these cities, not just Tampa and Orlando, but going back to the Tucson-Phoenix example, there are assets where Phoenix was the largest metropolitan area without a medical school in it, for example. It didn't have a main branch of a state university, so you had to build up ASU to the tier of U of A. It didn't have things like optics industry that you have in Tucson, which is really built around Kit Peak and the government, but is not being brought near venture capital and is not part of exports of the United States. So there's pieces in the two regions that when they looked at and sat down and combined, they were at a better strategic advantage in that combination than they were as separate discrete spaces. Also just scale. If you go forward and you look at the whole space, it gets to like a Chicago-sized metropolitan area by mid-21st century based on projections. And as a result, they could make a claim to, we need global connectivity just to recognize the sheer number of people that we have here right now. We're not just 4 million people in some golf courses. And you see this happening in various places. Right now, there's even I went and did a project at ASU for 6 months in spring 2006 and called the place the Sun Corridor. And now there's a Sun Corridor open for business, aggressive effort to take businesses out of California that do solar energy, for example.